I would say that this was primarily a sign of the times. It was a cultural issue. Those of us that had been in the corporate environment throughout the 1990s, in the high-tech environment in particular, we saw what quick wealth was doing to people. And it often left what I would say was a hole in one's soul, that the money would come, but the values would often go. The values that were touted at Enron had to do with being bold, being innovative, being aggressive, being assertive, but none of their values, at least those that we ever heard about, had to do with ethical character or ethical behavior. We know that people were just waiting for their stock to vest, and when the stock did vest, they thought that it would change their lives. And it wasn't unreasonable for people to expect that because they saw it happening all around them. And I think Texas, California was probably, they were both environments where that was happening, and there was no reason for people to think any differently with Enron. The difference with Enron, though, was that they were dealing in commodities. They weren't dealing with a tangible product. So the people that were there were tasked with thinking about how to do business differently. And unfortunately, some became more creative than what they should have at the time. All the regulations in the world at that time probably would not have made a difference, and didn't.
Well, I think if we look at Enron, I'm not so sure that better structure, better culture, or better regulation would have prevented such a fraud from occurring. Clearly, Enron was operating outside the bounds of what would be normally expected. But when you think about what regulation does and what guidelines do, is they create an expected set of standards for people to follow. And the leaders within those organizations set the tone for determining how that organization is going to follow those guidelines and follow within those expectations. So by themselves, regulation, governance, and guidelines would not necessarily have stopped or prevented the Enron from occurring. I think if you're really going to have a structure that prevents fraud from occurring, you need leaders with fortitude to call out and step forward and live and drive the behaviors of their organization.
So I think most businesses never approach their decision making in a situation where they think fraud is the right way to engage with their shareholders and with the business community. So I hope it's not a part of business culture at any time in our history. As we know, companies that engage in fraud are never long-term successful. They may enjoy some very short-run success, but it's not sustainable, and it will come to light over time. I think what we are looking at the time was a very overregulated industry, a company that had a lot of name prestige. There were awards being given to the company for how they managed their company and how they treated their people and so on, and yet they were also engaged in fraudulent activity. I think that the processes that have come to fruition since that time have, while many companies really resisted Sarbanes-Oxley and others, I think one of the things it has done is focus companies on the internal process that they need to engage in order to make sure that they can catch these types of activities and behavior.
Well, I'd like to believe that this was a one-off occurrence, but I think the activities in the subprime lending situation in 2008 are just another example of the same phenomenon. And that is we inadvertently and maybe sometimes very deliberately reward this kind of behavior in companies that take a very competitive stance in the marketplace. So how could we have avoided it? Well, you know, history shows that we haven't been very good at avoiding these kinds of situations. We put together a set of regulations. Some very smart people figure out what we can do to get around these regulations. And once again, if it's behavior that's rewarded either by the company or by the system, it will be repeated. So our history is one replete with examples of people pushing the envelope. I would hope that situations like this can be avoided in the future.
Dan, I think the problem at Enron was really one of culture. And it really starts with, I think, the most important principle for any corporation, and that is the tone at the top. The board was not actively engaged, the CEO was not actively engaged, nor was the CFO actively engaged, as we've come to learn, in ensuring that the moral compass of the corporation was on track. Rather, there was a culture of stock benefits, personal gain, motivating people to take over markets and really do negative things to their customers, all to the benefit of the corporation. Anytime you set that kind of tone at the top, it creates an opportunity for bad behavior, and I think that's what we saw in this case. No amount of regulation, in my view, and no amount of governance without the appropriate tone at the top measure is going to prevent this type of activity from occurring. Subsequent to the Enron debacle, what we've seen are other corporations that have had likewise bad tone at the top, and they've engaged in bad behaviors. I think that demonstrates that adding regulation doesn't necessarily change corporate behavior.